There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
In 1976, British evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins published The Selfish Gene. It made exactly the splash he'd intended, but people were a little bit confused. Not by the book itself. He did an incredible job explaining how genes work. What some people had trouble with was the title. By calling genes selfish, it almost implies that they do what they do on purpose. When they replicate and cause certain traits to realize in the resulting organism, the title made it sound like it was intended as a means to preserve themselves. Now, it's not really hard to grasp what Dawkins was going for. Genes are selfish in the sense that their job, and the one that they do very well, is to carry the instructions for building a piece of an organism. If DNA is the recipe book as a whole, then genes are the ingredients called for and the amount of each ingredient. If the organism survives long enough to have offspring, their offspring will receive those genes from both parents. The longer that line lives, the longer those genes will continue on. Forever. Maybe. Now, if they had a purpose, it would be to persist through time and to continue doing what they do best. In fact, Dawkins himself now wishes he'd used a different term.
The gene is immortal. In fact, a publisher once, when I showed him the first couple of chapters of The Selfish Gene, said you shouldn't call it that, you should call it the immortal gene. And perhaps I should have done. Genes are immortal in the sense that the coded information they contain is reproduced, is replicated with almost total fidelity, significantly, not absolutely total fidelity, generation after generation after generation, such that there are genes which are identical to what they were tens of millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago in a few cases. So genes are immortal, not the DNA, of course that's not, that turns over in a very short space of time, but the coded information is potentially immortal. And that means that the difference between a successful gene and an unsuccessful gene really matters. It's going to matter for millions of years. So the genes that make it through those millions of years are the ones that are good at it. And good at it means good at building bodies, good at controlling the processes of embryology, to make bodies which have what it takes to preserve those genes and pass them on. And so I use this phrase survival machine. A body, an individual, is a survival machine. And that's by far the most powerful way of interpreting what an individual organism is.
So yes, a gene can potentially be immortal, if and only if the survival machine, to use Dawkins' words, doesn't die before having offspring. If the recipe book is lost or destroyed, well, that recipe is gone. But what makes them immortal? As Professor Dawkins said, the difference between a successful gene and one which isn't matters a whole lot. I mean, he said it really matters. The genes in both you and I that we have to thank for our bodies and our physical traits have been in existence for millions, if maybe billions of years in some cases. It's mind-boggling. Some of those genes were present in some four-legged mammal ancestor long before another ancestor learned how to walk on two legs. Some genes mutated, and those mutations were expressed in physical traits. Some genes stayed the same or underwent very slight modifications so that they are virtually the same. To step back again and use Dawkins' words, we are survival machines for genes. The better the machine built by genes can cope in the world and the environment they are in, the longer they will last. They can truly be immortal. It's actually taken us a long time to learn as much as we do about them now.
I think we tend to think about genes maybe in the way we learned about them in high school. So we learned about Gregor Mendel. We learned that you might have one gene that encodes one trait, and it's a very simple kind of pattern. And I'd say Mendel is a great place to start learning about genes, but it's a really bad place to stop.
That was science writer Carl Zimmer in an interview he did for the Open Mind YouTube channel. Now, it's only been in the last few decades that we've been able to truly grasp just how powerful they are when it comes to building the machines that carry them. We learn more every day. Now, the reason Zimmer said that Mendel is a really bad place to stop was not a dig against Mendel and his peas. It's because the genes that built the survival machines we're surrounded by aren't simply a one gene per one trait deal, like the color or shape of peas. Some traits are realized by thousands of genes together. We are still at the early stages of this knowledge. We have about 20,000 genes that code proteins, but
of those, I'd say the really well-studied ones are only about 2,000. There are actually over 5,000 of our protein-coding genes that have never been the subject of a focused study. So for the most part, our genome is still quite a mysterious wilderness.
Mysterious wilderness. I like that. Now, it does feel that way, doesn't it? Charles Darwin, when he wrote his great book on evolution by natural selection, knew nothing about genes. He knew about traits and what natural selection selected for, but not how those traits were inherited. It took Gregor Mendel and his peas to pave the way, and his work was ignored at first, until it was rediscovered at the turn of the 20th century. So, will we ever unlock all the secrets of genes? Well, probably not. We may come close. The more we learn, the more we tinker. It's now at the point where we've come to the realization that we can change the coding of the survival machines ourselves. Efforts with gene therapy to treat or prevent diseases isn't science fiction anymore. There are technologies available to us now, like CRISPR, that allow us to actually edit genes for desired results. For example, it's been used to edit the genes of mosquitoes in the battle against malaria. It's also been used in human clinical trials for cancer treatment. But changing the very source code of our bodies may have unintended ramifications unless we fully understand what we're tinkering with. Again, we have to be careful what we do. That's one genie which, pardon the pun, will be hard to put back in the bottle once it's out. Now I'll give Richard Dawkins the last word from a Big Think video.
I think we have to worry about possible consequences of things that we do, and the ability to edit our own genomes is one thing we ought to worry about. I'm not sure it's so much an ethical problem as a more practical problem. What would the consequences be? Would the consequences be bad? And they might be. I think it's worth noticing that long before CRISPR, long before we became capable of editing our genomes in any way, we have been editing the genomes of domestic animals and plants by artificial selection, not artificial mutation, which is what we're now talking about, but artificial selection. When you think that a Pekingese is a wolf, a modified wolf, a genetically modified wolf, modified not by directly manipulating genes, but by choosing for breeding individuals who have certain characteristics, for example, small, snub-nosed, etc., and making a wolf turn into a Pekingese. Well, we've been doing that very successfully with domestic animals like dogs, cows, domestic plants like maize, for a long time. We've never done that to humans, or hardly at all.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material used for this episode at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions or even want to comment on the episode, you can reach me at rick@coastmedia.com. I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.